Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar about decision-making in the European Union's common foreign and security policy. My name is Jan Wouters. I'm Jean Monnet Chair at the University of Leuven and Director of the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies. I would like to welcome you, and I welcome you on behalf of 4 organizers. That is the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies. That is the ENGAGE project, about which I will tell you a little bit more. That is the GLOBE project, an already up and running Horizon 2020 project. And that is EUDIPLO, which is a Jean Monnet Network project about the European Union as a diplomatic actor. I should say in particular a few words about the new kid on the block, and that is the ENGAGE project. We all know that the European Union has a vocation to become a stronger global actor. And the EU-funded Horizon 2020 project called ENGAGE, coordinated by our Spanish colleagues, ESADE, brings together a very high-level consortium of 9 universities and 4 think tanks to advance precisely this push of the European Union for a stronger and more united voice of Europe in the world. The ENGAGE project is only kickstarting right now. In fact, it will have its kickoff conference next week. I'll say a few words about that. But the focus of this new project will indeed be on how the European Union, and by that we mean both the Union and its member states, can effectively and sustainably harness all its tools in a joined-up external action alongside its common foreign and security policy, and of course, its common security and defense policy. For those interested, I warmly invite you to join our kickoff conference next week, Wednesday, the 16th of June, under the title, A New Governance Architecture for a Global Europe, ? The link to that conference will appear in the chat box. I see it already. So you can quickly register if you want. It's all for free. And I can tell you there will be very nice keynotes, including by Dr. Javier Solana, Rosa Balfour, and Josep Borrell, among others. And this brings us seamlessly to the topic of today, because if we want to explore how to make the European Union a stronger global actor, it makes sense to revisit the decision-making processes in CFSP. There have been recent cases, as you may know, of one or several member states blocking EU action in matters going from human rights to sanctions, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this has brought the whole question back to the fore about the current decision-making modes in CFSP. I should also point to the latest State of the Union address of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who pleaded strongly in favor of more qualified majority voting. You will hear our acronym all the time, QMV, qualified majority voting in CFSP, in the Common Foreign and Security Policy, in particular with regard to sanctions, for which the EU jargon is restrictive measures, as you may know, and human rights. And I should also add that we live still under the era of the Treaty of Lisbon, which has been in force with us for nearly 12 years now, and which does provide, as we will hear, different possibilities to smoothen decision-making under CFSP in the Council. This being said, unanimity remains the general rule and practice right now. But is this compatible with the Union's geopolitical ambitions? What are ways forward in this respect? What are the pros? What are the cons of more majority-based decision-making in EU foreign policy? Or should the ownership of all member states prevail? And in that sense, should we continue to strive for having them all agree on what we decide on. We have 4 high-level experts, 2 seasoned practitioners, and 2 seasoned academic experts who will discuss this matter together with you. And let me quickly introduce our distinguished speakers and then really get into our discussions. First of all, we have His Excellency Pierre Vimont. Ambassador Pierre Vimont is currently Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe, which is one of the partners in the ENGAGE project. It's, I think, pointless to try to resume his career. It's more than 38 years diplomatic high-level career with the French Foreign Service, including very prestigious posts like being ambassador to the United States, permanent representative to the European Union, chief of staff to not less than 3 French foreign ministers, and very importantly, the very first executive secretary general of the European External Action Service, une sommité, as we say sometimes. Then we have Dr. Karolina Pomorska, who is a Jean Monnet Chair and Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. She is also really a seasoned expert. She publishes, and she published amply on CFSP and on the External Action Service, inter alia. Then we have Mr. Stefan Marcotte, who is head of the legal department of the European External Action Service. And Stefan brings a wealth of experience because previously he has been legal advisor in the Council of the European Union, there focusing mainly on external relations, but also on CFSP. And he has also been legal advisor at the EU delegation to the United Nations in New York. And last but not least at all, our colleague and friend, Professor Ramses Wessel, who is Professor of European Law at the University of Groningen, also a partner in the ENGAGE project. And in fact, he is also the coordinator of the EUDIPLO Jean Monnet project. And of course, Professor Wessel brings very strong expertise on EU external relations, on international organizations, on multi-level relations between legal orders, and so on and so forth. I should also mention that he is currently Vice President of the European Society for International Law. So with that, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have, let's say, the introduction done. And I would really like to give the floor now to Ambassador Pierre Vimont. We, of course, hope that you will engage actively with us through the chat box and that we will be able between now and 2 p.m. Brussels time to say, have a fruitful dialogue with each other. But it's high time we give the floor to His Excellency Pierre Vimont. Mr. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, and thank you for inviting me to this session where I'm able to meet old friends like Stephan, who worked with me at the External Action Service, but also to meet 2 impressive academics whose work I follow very closely, if only to try to understand what I was trying to do while I was working at the External Action Service. You know, that's the burden of practitioners. It's only when they have ended their term that they are able to understand what they try to do. Let me try to be as brief as possible in those introductory remarks. You asked me, Professor, to give the sort of political point of view on the whole issue of QMV. And let me give you just a couple of observations. The first one, if I am correct, the whole argument about moving towards qualified majority voting is that it will at last overcome the lack of progress we have been witnessing with regard to the common foreign and security policy of the European Union. As the argument goes, bring in qualified majority and the whole picture will be different. Foreign policy will be speed up. And the countries that oppose and that have strong opinion on such and such issue will be either sidelined because they will not be in the majority, or if only by the deterrent factor, I would say, by the risk of using qualified majority, will be silenced to some extent and will decide to join the majority group. I personally think that it is going to work that way, because at the end of the day, for me, this is not a matter of legal provision or a new voting regime. It is about politics. Whatever we may think about it, and of course, I'm one of those who would gladly support qualified majority, is just that, in my opinion, this would not solve the problem. And in the whole decision-making process, voting only comes at the end. And the reality about the so-called shortcomings of European foreign policy at the moment have a lot to do with what is upstream, how we shape a proposition, how the discussion goes on, all the political process that leads at the end of the day to a decision. This is what is the problem. Could I add that on many of matters, EU matters that have to deal with qualified majority, what we call les affaires communautaires, the community method, where qualified majority is the natural rule, we are witnessing more and more because of the division gap between member states, that qualified majority voting doesn't work all that well, even when it is applied. As we have seen in 2015, in one of the most contentious issues related to migration, the whole issue of relocation, the relocation scheme put forward by the Commission, at the end of the day, the Council went for a qualified majority, got it nearly thanks to the Polish vote, if I remember well. But as the Polish government changed camp afterwards and joined the other Visegrad countries, the fact is that the decision was never really fully implemented. And even those member states who had voted for the relocation scheme started to feel somewhat uncomfortable with this. So my point is really that one. It is a political matter and it has to be dealt with in a political way and with, I would say, political tools. What do I mean? And that would be my second observation. What do I mean by a political matter? For me, it is a twofold observation I would like to do here. The first one is about the overall sphere of foreign and security policy of the European Union, is that we have seen since we introduced foreign policy into the treaty, namely from Maastricht on, that in spite of adopting provisions, and new provisions, an interesting one, innovative, a decision that the European Union should deal with foreign policy, which was not the case before in any one of the treaties that were adopted before the Maastricht Treaty. In spite of this endorsement, member states have had strong reservations. And from the beginning, it has been the case. Remember that with the Maastricht Treaty, we invented at the time what we called common position or common actions. There were clear legal provisions in the Lisbon Treaty about these options, these possible options. And the reality is that member states were very reluctant to go along with them. And quite often they prefer to go back to the old article of the Rome Treaty, namely the Article 235, where you had to use unanimity and where member states had the impression that they kept their sovereignty on these issues. Because I think this is the real issue about the common foreign and security policy, is that member states are still somewhat reserved about the idea that by accepting to move along with the new provisions that are there in the Lisbon Treaty, they are accepting to some extent a transfer of sovereignty, or one could say a sharing of sovereignty that in the bottom of their hearts, they are somewhat reluctant to go along with. And that's one of the issues we're facing time and again with regard to CFSP. The second political issue, I think, has to do with day-to-day topics around foreign policy. In fact, I'm sure Stefan, who's still in the External Action Service, could tell you much more about this. In fact, the bones of contention are not all that numerous. Of course, they are the ones the media and the social network will go after, because this is where opposition comes in. But in fact, around 90% of the discussion on some issues, on any issue related to CFSP, there is consensus, there is agreement, and unanimity can go along without too much difficulty. The ones that are contentious, namely human rights, China, sometimes sanctions, but are not that many, in fact, or the whole issue of gender equality, those are the real issues that are the controversial one and on which it is often difficult to agree. I could add also, because we've seen it recently, the Middle East peace process, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. But out of these few topics, controversial ones, in fact, the system is more or less working all right for the time being. Last observation to reassure you, Professor, that I'm not going to be too long. Last observation, therefore, how to move ahead. How to move ahead in order to improve our decision-making process. I would say the first thing I would do is to try to use the current provisions of the Lisbon Treaty. And I'm sure that both Karolina and Hamsis will come back into this and give you much more insight, and Stefan also. But in fact, if you read the Lisbon Treaty, you see that the point has been raised during the negotiation up to the Lisbon Treaty, and that options are there that could be used in order to overcome opposition. Constructive abstention, what is called in French la clause parallèle, parallel clause, that allows for the European Council to ask the Council to use qualified majority. And in fact, in my experience in the External Action Service, quite often I've heard one or another foreign minister at some point during Foreign Affairs Council saying, why don't we go for, why don't we vote? And why don't we go for qualified majority in order to overcome our differences? And the answer all over the room by a vast majority of member states was, over my dead body. We don't want voting. We want to find common agreement. So it seems to me that we should come back to the current provisions and see how we could, on a progressive, gradual approach, try to bring all the minds of ministers, of diplomats, to this idea that let's start in a sort of very pragmatic way to use the current provisions rather than fighting each other on the whole issue of qualified majority. That's maybe a nice way of starting and moving in the right direction rather than going immediately to what would be a very difficult conversation and probably one that could not reach an agreement among member states at this stage. So I would plead for pragmatism at the moment. And I'll stop there, Professor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. This is exactly what we hoped for. Indeed, a good dose of diplomatic and political realism and pragmatism, and based on your very, very rich experience. So, merci beaucoup. And let's turn now to the academic perspective, if I may. So we come in the very first place with Dr. Karolina Pomorska to share with us some, let's say, perspectives from a political science perspective. Please, Karolina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So you were asked to deliver a short introduction about the pros and cons of qualified majority vote. And it seems to me that the pros are pretty straightforward, and already Ambassador mentioned them. So the proponents of the QMV often say, well, it is going to help us overcome the sometimes occurring deadlock and increase effectiveness of the EFP. Now, so that is clear. I would argue that probably we need to be a bit more precise and maybe say that what we are going to improve is actually the efficiency of decision-making. So the speed and maybe the easiness of achieving a result, but not so much, or at least we don't know whether that would directly link to improving effectiveness of foreign policy. Actually, it could, but one could also imagine that if the member states do not feel ownership or are not that committed to implementation, it could even lead to decreasing of decreased effectiveness. So I would say this efficiency of decision-making is the core argument. And before I move on to discuss some disadvantages that I think are sometimes forgotten in the debate, I would like to say that it seems that QMV is a rather unlikely scenario at the moment, even though we have some very powerful stakeholders calling for it. Of course, there is a very large number of member states that are completely opposed. And I think most proponents come from if I can say that, Western Europe, and a lot of opposition comes from the states that joined more recently, and also from Eastern and Southern Europe. So I would like to talk briefly about two disadvantages. One of them is the potential for changing a very fundamental culture of negotiations in the Council at all levels, not only at the high levels of ministers, but also at the kind of everyday bread and butter negotiations that start with the working groups, and they are very important. A lot is decided already there. And the second one, the potential for decreasing the ownership by the member states. And what I noticed in the last years, when doing my fieldwork in Brussels, doing interviews, and that was already a while ago, that there was an increase in complaints coming from member states, from smaller member states, and not only from recent enlargement, but in general, who kind of started telling more often the story that they don't feel sometimes they are treated seriously, or that they are being a bit sidelined or a bit ignored. We could debate whether that's the case or not, but this was the perception out there. And recently, I think what we are witnessing is a lot of frustration. So this frustration then was even made worse by the fact that, of course, we have this recent vetoes and blocking of decision-making, especially from Hungary, but not only, from Poland and Greece, other states. And that's one. Observers say that leads to decreased, as I said before, ineffective foreign policy. That's what we hear. And two, that is more, I think, internal view. A lot of diplomats in the Council are complaining that, especially Hungary, a bit Poland, are violating one of the fundamental informal rules of negotiations in CFSP, which is, yes, it is fine to object and to to try and block decision, but you need to have very sound reasons, and what is more, you need to voice those reasons. So you need to convince the others that you have those serious reasons, and okay, they are all on the same boat, so there is some reciprocity there. Now, what we hear more and more often is that especially Hungarian representatives, they do not engage in this discursive attempt. So sometimes diplomats tell us, well, we feel like they are blocking for blocking. And that, of course, again, leads to frustration. But just to add, this is not the only source of frustration, because it works also from the other perspective. There are also countries that are a bit frustrated with External Action Service. A lot of smaller states had the idea that with the Lisbon Treaty, European External Action Service would be a kind of an ally in the system. And I'm sure in many cases this is so. However, also what we hear is some disappointment. So smaller states and mid-states, they are saying, well, of course, what we discovered, there is politics, and there is very unequal access in some parts of the EEAS, and also not all the countries are represented equally. So it really did not fulfill, at least immediately, some of those expectations. There are sometimes complaints that not everything is done transparently, and we've seen frustration with the European global strategy. Again, we can of course debate if this is justified or not, but we do hear that as a perception coming something from diplomats. Now, moving on quickly to veto, because it is such a key element of those requests or those calls for introducing QMV, I think we need to consider why those countries are using the veto, why they are blocking. And I'd say there are three possible explanations we can think about. Number one is a norm clash. And here I would think about fundamental norms, so the ones that are in the treaty, and procedural norms. So here we have a divergence. Ambassador, you already mentioned some of the areas where there is this clash, at least between the norms that are declared by the governments of those countries and the norms that are written down as fundamental values in the EU. Second explanation, that we have less skill when it comes to negotiations and pre-cooking of certain items. Of course, one could say some very experienced member states do not need to veto because they are so efficient beforehand that they already mold the proposals, and they are negotiating well, building coalitions, so they do not need to refer to veto, which is sometimes considered as actually a sign of failure because you were not able to negotiate better before. And that might carry some weight when we think about the letting go of many seasoned diplomats when the governments in Hungary and Poland came into power. I think Ambassador Marquardt is one of them. So many experienced diplomats were kind of put on a side track. And finally, the third explanation, and I think this one is maybe most kind of dangerous, is the one that simply those governments don't care. So, and this is also what we hear to some extent, both from diplomats that are told to take certain steps from those countries, and from those being frustrated, they say, well, we don't think they really care about some of these issues. So, and this is because what is important sometimes is only domestic politics or even party politics. And they do not care that much about international reputation or what the others in the EU think about them, which used to be a super important issue, but they care about consolidating the party line or consolidating their own electorate. So I think from those three reasons, we can already see that maybe the problem is elsewhere, and maybe the QMV is not the way not the best way to address it. So I want to, if I still have a bit of time, to address the issue of changing the culture. So in the council working groups, in the committees, at the level of the council, we have a number of very strong, very robust, informal ways of doing things, what we call procedural norms. And they were developed throughout decades. And we could talk about consensus building, taking everybody on board, not being a troublemaker, or at least not too often, justifying your position, respect agreed language, and so on and so on. And of course, all those are there to exactly make the decision-making process more efficient. And socialization is very strong. We observe new member states coming in, new participants, and being very quickly socialized into these norms. And I think this informal code of conduct is quite important when we think about what European foreign policy is and how member states feel in the system. Now, if we change the decision-making into QMV, of course, this formal rule will likely affect a lot the fundamental rules, the fundamental norms that guide the member states in their negotiations. And we can see that when we compare the working groups or the committees in the foreign and security policy and those in the former, like Ambassador mentioned, community method. And of course, one could say, well, but they do not vote anyway. And even with QMV, the vote is not taking place a lot. But we need to remember that the shadow of the vote is there. And that shadow is very, very important. And of course, it shapes to a large extent the informal code of conduct. So, and that was an excellent example of this QMV vote on migration and how the atmosphere developed, which was not very friendly. And I don't think something we would like to see in the EU. And also how the norms can change quickly, or the culture of negotiations. We saw that when the chairs from the EEAS were established in the council. So I don't want to generalize that's the case all the time, but in many groups, it is a very difficult job because the chairs are not considered as one of us. That's what the member states tell us. That's what the chairs tell us, that it's much easier to attack the chair now because there is no reciprocity, that it's a bit more difficult to chair the working groups because, yeah, it's not anymore the mix of the member states. So it did for sure have some impact already on how the negotiations proceed. And finally, just a word on the ownership that was already mentioned before. We have generally more politicization and more contestation when it comes to European integration. And that, of course, also is present in European foreign policy, was fueled by Lisbon, gave fuel to populist governments in power who saw it as a further transfer of powers to Brussels. And I think introducing QMV would only increase that situation. So we can debate, you know, if we have QMV, can you imagine policy towards Russia without the Baltic states? Or can we imagine policy towards Mediterranean without Italy? Or policy towards Cuba without Spain on board? We can debate. And I know some people would say, well, why not? For me, I cannot, I don't think it's a good idea. So just to sum up, I think that maybe the problem is elsewhere. And the problem is that EU has been allowing some member states to disrespect fundamental values, the rule of law, and frankly, turn some governments into semi-authoritarianism. Obama just mentioned that they were actually authoritarian, and academics argue which stage of authoritarianism we are at. But the point is that the EU has not been seeing, or the member states have not been seen as doing much about that. Understandably, we have elections in Germany, so we hear certain things coming out from Germany now, but it's a little bit strange to listen to that when you think about what Germany has been doing or not, you know, when there were changes happening in Hungary. So I think that is the key problem, as Dan Kellerman has it, you know, that you allow Trojan horses to emerge inside the EU. And this is what we should be addressing seriously. And I don't think that engineering, again, institutional engineering, might be helpful at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karolina. This was really, really very insightful and very complementary to what Ambassador Vimont told us. And I'm glad you also made reference in your last point to Professor Dan Keleman, who is a good colleague and friend working with us on another project, which is not the organizer of today's event, but that's the Reconnect project. Now, we have heard quite a number of important statements already. I would say currently the ones advancing or at least arguing in favor of QMV seem to be in the minority. So we will definitely not even have a qualified majority in this panel, but let's see how the discussion unfolds, and let's also listen to the audience. Can I ask our, say, speakers also to keep an eye on the Q&A box, because already some very interesting questions are popping up, and I would like to come back to that in a moment. But let's now turn to the lawyers, and that's of course going to probably change a little bit the tone of the conversation, but that's very good, because we also, as we are a Rechtsgemeinschaft, as they say, the community of law of the European Union, we definitely have to take a look back at the treaties and at the legal practice. And I'm very delighted that we also have Mr. Stefan Marcotte from the European External Action Service with us. And let me maybe, Stefan, if you allow me, we didn't really coordinate on this, but I heard in previous presentations, I heard the word veto being mentioned. And I'm sure you may have a little comment on that terminology, but also when Ambassador Vimont made this beautiful reference to la méthode communautaire, the community method, which is so fundamental, and which also, I think, to be very honest, the legal experts should probably explain to us again, also for the non-experts in the audience, what is so specific about that community method, and why indeed do the member states not want to hear of that within the CFSP area, where Article 24 of the Treaty on European Union continues to highlight the specific procedures and mechanisms of decision-making of CFSP. So if you don't really mind, Stefan, could you maybe also say a few words about that, but then please do your story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you to you and the other organizers for inviting me to this webinar. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I always enjoy this kind of webinar because it is indeed. I mean, I'm working on these issues on a daily basis. Just yesterday, the cabinet of the High Representative asked me for an urgent note for Borrell to indeed recall again, summarize and this was very then topical, summarize the possibilities of QMV under the treaties, because he is also increasingly confronted with questions from the media in relation to these situations of blockages that were mentioned, and I just sent this morning, just ahead of the seminar, a first draft of that note to him. Although there is one specific issue, I will come back to that, is indeed, and that is a very difficult question, to what extent indeed the legal rules on voting, unanimity QMV, can be transposed indeed to political acts adopted by the Council, such as Council conclusions and statements, and that is part of the issue that we are here discussing in Brussels. But first, let me indeed highlight or take you back a little bit to the legal parameters, and indeed, being a lawyer, I can only tell you about the legal provisions of the treaties and the way I would interpret them, without indeed taking any position on whether QMV is a good idea or not in the CFSP. First of all, perhaps it is useful to take a step back historically and to recall that indeed QMV is nothing new in the CFSP. In a sense, after Lisbon, indeed, perhaps because of the new institutional actors that were created, notably the High Representative, this question now seems to come to the fore again. But it is not a new issue, I would suggest, at least not if I look at the treaty provisions. In fact, all the current elements that you see in the Treaty of Lisbon on QMV, on the possibility to use QMV voting, existed before. The Treaty of Lisbon, and I think Ramses will expand on that, did not actually add that much, except perhaps the so-called passerelle clause. But just to recall that indeed, in the very first iteration of the Treaty of on European Union, the Treaty of Maastricht, there was a bit hidden in one of the articles, Article J3, paragraph 2, on the so-called joint actions. There already the member states introduced an element, a possibility of QMV, whereby the Council could have, once it had adopted by unanimity a joint action, it could define then further elements or questions to be decided by QMV in the course of the implementation of such a joint action. And that was in 1993. And then in 1997, with the Treaty of Amsterdam, was already then a very significant expansion of the possibilities to act by QMV, because that is when the treaty already, or the member states already agreed indeed, to provide that when, for example, when you had the Council adopting joint actions or common positions or decisions adopted on the basis of a so-called common strategy adopted by the European Council, which also was a new element introduced in the treaty, then the Council could act by qualified majority. And the same also for decisions implementing a joint action or a common position. And then in 2001, the Treaty of Nice indeed added a few more elements, for example, the possibility for the Council to appoint EU special representatives by qualified majority. And also interestingly, even though that has never been used, and I was actually even myself surprised to rediscover that provision looking back at those earlier versions of the treaty, even international agreements in the foreign policy could be concluded by the Council by QMV if they were linked to the implementation of a joint action or a common position. And now, of course, the Treaty of Lisbon, perpetuated those elements, or still contains all these elements, which were also subsequent in between transcribed into the draft treaty on a constitution for Europe, but also added a number of other significant changes, and I think Ramses will address those. So, but building on the existing acquis, if I may say. Now, perhaps, yeah, at this point, I could indeed address your comment on the méthode communautaire and the CFSP. Well, I mean, I think one significant advantage of the Treaty of Lisbon that indeed, if I may say, the méthode communautaire has disappeared because the European community has been subsumed under the European Union. And therefore, let's not forget that in the general provisions of the TEU, if you look at Article 16, paragraph 3, the general voting rule for the Council is qualified majority. And that applies across the board to the whole treaty. Now, of course, it says unless otherwise provided, and it is, of course, true that the Treaty on European Union in the CFSP chapter does provide otherwise, because there, indeed, the basic general voting rule is unanimity. But nonetheless, I think the possibilities of qualified majority are there. They've been there from the very beginning, but they have not been, and they're still there, and they have been reinforced by the Treaty of Lisbon. But in practice, and that would be my second part, they have not been used until now. And indeed, I think that's a point that Pierre alluded to. If you look at the practice of the Council, decisions, I mean, in my time in the Council, looking back at that time, I can't remember a single instance of voting in the Council on a CFSP decision. In the Council, meaning at the level of the ministers. The agreement of the members of the Council on any CFSP act, now, you know, on a proposal from the High Representative, is normally sought at the level of the working parties, of the preparatory bodies, which do not vote according to the rules of procedure of the Council, which operate by consensus. And indeed, the respective chair of the working party, and it does not really matter that much, I would suggest, at least not from an institutional point of view, whether the chair is a permanent chair appointed by the HR or the chair of the rotating presidency. That doesn't really matter. But what the chairs do is they work as long as possible, as long as needed on a given text, in order to secure agreement, and that is done by consensus. And then at the level of the Council, most, if not all, CFSP legal acts are adopted as a so-called A item without any formal vote. There's only one case in 2008 where indeed one member state used the possibility of constructive abstention. That was Cyprus, when the Council adopted the joint action on ULEX Kosovo. And that was a situation, although I don't even think that a formal vote was taken, but at least the votes of the other member states that needed to be recorded in order to assess whether there was still unanimity, leaving aside the abstention of Cyprus. And then we have another case also prior to that, that was in 2008, where in 2001, indeed, if you look at least the legal basis identified in the respective legal acts, and that's quite interesting, where the Council in 1999 and 2001 did in fact use this possibility of qualified majority at two levels, when in the framework of the common strategy on Russia adopted by the European Council, it then subsequently adopted a joint action implementing that or implementing certain aspects of that strategy. And there, if the legal basis referred to the possibility of the legal basis allowing qualified majority. And then even subsequently, the Council adopted a decision implementing that joint action, again, by qualified majority, at least looking at the legal basis. However, in practice, this never happened, also in those cases, and those rather old cases. Again, nowadays, in the area of sanctions, the Council regularly uses implementing decisions, and therefore one of the express possibilities under Article 31, paragraph 2, to use qualified majority. And the Council, and we will put, as you know, in the proposal of the High Representative, and the Council will then normally not change that, we will identify indeed the legal basis that allows qualified majority voting. Nonetheless, even on these implementing decisions that are, for example, about listing individuals, adding individuals to a specific sanctions list, there is never any vote, and the Council, even though a vote could actually be taken. And we had a recent instance, in fact, I think it was in the framework of the Belarus sanctions, where the matter was actually brought for discussion to the level of the ministers, and the High Representative, in his capacity of chair, could have actually pushed for a vote. I mean, that is the prerogative of the chair. But even then, the High Representative chose not to do so and to try to continue to find a political solution. And then the text was eventually then adopted by consensus a week later, I think, even though it was only about additional listings of specific persons and individuals. And not only that, not only does the Council indeed not use the qualified majority possibility, but it even openly contradicts those possibilities offered by the treaty. If you look at some of the decisions that look like implementing decisions in the CFSP in the field of sanctions, where the Council puts indeed in the decision adopting a specific regime, that the Council has the possibility to modify, amend the list in the annex, about the persons and entities listed, which would look like the legal basis for an implementing decision. And there the Council, we normally on behalf of the HR, we propose the simple provision saying that the Council will can then on proposal from the HR modify the list. And the Council now quite routinely acts introduces by unanimity in that provision, and therefore depriving itself of the possibility to use an implementing decision as foreseen by the treaty, which is a bit puzzling. Now, one I think interesting question arising in that context is indeed also in the specific, and we can come back to that perhaps in the questions and answers. I think it's a question that you raised, Jan, in our preliminary conversations. How does, for example, in sanctions, this unanimity requirement relate to the fact that the regulation implementing the CFSP decision is under the TFEU is actually adopted by qualified majority, or can be adopted by qualified majority, because even again, there in reality, there's never any majority voting. And finally, the last point, I alluded to that already before. There's a big question indeed on whether indeed QMV can be applied to non-legal acts. And there again, I think the consistent practice of the Council, also supported by the Council Legal Service, is that this is not possible, and that voting is indeed reserved for the adoption of legal acts. Now, so the reality is indeed that the legal instruments and procedures are there. I would suggest that we don't even need to ask the European Council to use the passerelle clause to expand the cases of qualified majority. I mean, the possibilities on the treaty already kind of covers a lot of possibilities, including the domain of sanctions. But the member states within the Council or the members of the Council are just reluctant to use those possibilities. And indeed, I think, well, and this despite the fact that indeed the Treaty of Lisbon, despite saying that the CFSP remains subject to specific rules, nonetheless, it has fully integrated the CFSP into the legal and institutional order of the CFSP. It even qualifies it as a competence of the EU, which could suggest that member states have indeed transferred some competences in the CFSP, but probably in reality, that's not the case. That's the point, I think, also that Pierre, you mentioned in terms of the sovereignty. And I think that indeed, I think the perception among the member states still is, despite the improvements of Lisbon, that foreign policy is still very much intergovernmental at its core. And that for that reason, they can't imagine envisage anything else than consensus in foreign policy, or at the most unanimity, and with the possibility of a constructive abstention. And then that leads me indeed to one of your questions, Jan. Indeed, and that results in what you refer to as a veto right of member states. Although I would suggest indeed we don't normally it's a matter of terminology, but in the EU context we normally try to avoid, I think, the term veto right, because it has quite a negative connotation. And from my sense, also having been in New York, I think this is more like UN Security Council jargon. And even then, if you look at the rules of procedure of the Security Council, you will not find the word veto or anything like that. It just speaks about the concurring votes of the permanent members that are required for any decision to be adopted. But yes, of course, politically it is kind of a veto right, if you want, because it's probably linked to then indeed sovereign national interests, and that. But we would just then note, the council secretary would just then note indeed that there's no unanimity, because there's no, I mean, often the council works with indicative votes already at the level of COREPER, and then it would just note the absence of any consensus or absence of unanimity, and not accuse any member to having used a veto right or something like that. So I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for addressing all these very important points. I have a little, well, remark, or if you wish, question, but we could discuss it later on, about your statement that the community method disappeared with Lisbon. Well, the name community disappeared, but of course the community method as such is, I would say, alive and kicking, and has even been generalized, with the exception of CFSP. So in a certain way, it's been at the same time the death and the great resurrection of the community method in the Lisbon Treaty. Okay, we now go to our distinguished colleague and friend, Ramses Wessel, to further enlighten us on the legal aspects of decision-making. Ramses, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Jan. It's a pleasure to join this esteemed panel. And especially listening to the practitioners, I always feel a bit more modest speaking from my ivory tower, which, by the way, may be a far too fancy term for the study I have been in my house that you can see in the background for the last year or so. So indeed, following up on Stefan's interesting points, and one of the remarks that Stefan made is actually we already do have possibilities in the Lisbon Treaty. So my brief perhaps would be to list a few of those possibilities that we currently have, and just take you through them and see what the possibilities are. Let me try and, as a real lawyer, also share something that that we have here in terms of text. Basically, what I wanted to do is the following. First of all, moving to the next slide. What I'm perhaps going to do is sort of summarizing what we have heard in terms of options that we are currently seeing in terms of the possibilities for CFSP. So what exactly is the problem, and what are the facts? What are the legal facts that we are facing? First of all, very, very importantly, let me underline something that Stefan Marcotte just made, and a remark that he just made. CFSP is a union competence. For lawyers, this is a key issue, especially because CFSP is often mentioned as belonging to the member states. If you look at the treaty, it is mentioned as a union competence quite a few times in the treaty text. And then, of course, you can still debate whether that is an exclusive competence or a shared competence or something else. Obviously, I think we would quite quickly agree that it is not an exclusive competence of the European Union, despite the fact that, by the way, all CFSP international agreements are EU-only agreements, so they're not concluded together with the member states. They're simply concluded by the EU only, which normally would hint, at least, at an exclusive competence. But leaving that aside for the discussion, perhaps, because it's a bit teasing the political scientists as well. So what kind of rules do we have? Of course, we have the famous one here that we have been discussing now over the last hour, Article 31, paragraph 1, unanimity as the rule, basically, except where the chapter provides otherwise. And indeed, there's quite a few things that Stefan also hinted at that provide us with possibilities for qualified majority voting. So the exam question that I very often use in my exams on indicating the differences between CFSP and other EU policy areas, like so in CFSP, everything needs to be decided by unanimity, true or false. Of course, that is not correct because there are quite a few options in the treaty. And even as you can see here in Article 31, paragraph 2, the Council shall act by qualified majority in the cases that are mentioned here. And obviously, shall is always underlined by legal scholars, as indicating a sort of obligation to follow that rule. And just to summarize again, you can see the three options that are mentioned here on the base decisions on the basis of a decision of the European Council, on a proposal of the HR following a specific request from the European Council, or in the case of appointing a special representative. So those are already things that have been included in the current legal regime. And obviously, during those discussions when they were drafting the treaty, one or two member states said, yeah, but what if this really goes against our vital vital interests of national policy? Could we please have an emergency break? Yes, and as you can see, that one was included as well. So solutions to overcome the problem that we have been facing over the past 10 years. Indeed, we may still have to debate whether this is actually a problem, having QMV, or whether it is actually a solution, because I could easily argue that without QMV, we would not have had a CFSP. So in that sense, I may also not help to reach the qualified majority vote in this panel when we would decide on introducing QMV. So this is the famous passerelle clause that was already mentioned by my other fellow panelists here. The European Council may unanimously, obviously, adopt a decision stipulating that the Council shall act by qualified majority in other cases than the ones that I have just mentioned. Again, obviously, and that is just to remind you, not for decisions having military or defense implications. Throughout the treaty, this is something that the member states really said, well, this is something we will not accept any form of QMV. But for procedural questions, it is possible, and not even, as you can see here, and that is interesting to note, not even qualified majority, but a simple majority. For procedural questions, the Council shall act by a majority of its members. A question to the petitioners would be, how often does this happen, and how do you decide on what a procedural question is or not? Finally, here on this slide, obviously, the famous, perhaps, link between CFSP decisions under CFSP as such, and decisions on restrictive measures that are being taken under Article 215 in the Treaty on Functioning of the European Union. As far as I know, those decisions, so a unanimous CFSP decision and a qualified majority regulation, for instance, are taken at the same time during the same council meeting. They may have a different history, but in the end, they're very much linked. And here you can see that perhaps the QMV is more theoretical, because in the end, you would need this unanimous CFSP decision to start thinking about sanctions, most of the sanctions at least, in general. Just to mention one exception or solution, if you want, that has not been mentioned yet, that has to do with international agreements. This is an interesting case, of course, the Kazakhstan case, where the court basically said that you can conclude those international agreements, so following basically the community method, if you want, even if those international agreements contain certain CFSP elements. So in other words, QMV is possible also for international agreements, and CFSP elements do not really block the procedure in that sense, if they're not, of course, a key element in those international agreements. Another thing to mention here is obviously the possibility for differentiated integration. The treaty allows member states to cooperate closely. As you can see, Article 46, paragraph 2, the Council shall adopt a decision establishing permanent structured cooperation that we now call PESCO, and determining the list of participating member states. The Council shall act by qualified majority after consulting the HR. And it also uses QMV to allow states to join PESCO or to suspend the state from PESCO, or allowing states to leave, and which is actually done without any voting, as you can see on this slide. So all kinds of possibilities that are somehow hidden in the treaty to deal with CFSP on a non-unanimous basis, sometimes also referred to as sleeping beauties that just have to be kissed awake at a certain moment. I'm almost at the end, Jan, so don't worry about this. Just to refer to a study that we recently did, and you can see the reference at the bottom of this slide, looking at what kinds of decisions the union has actually been taken, what kind of topics have been addressed. And you see that if you look at these figures, and I'm not going into detail, that sanctions are the most used instruments in CFSP. And in CSDP, you see that obviously nearly 50% of the decisions concern civilian and military missions. Basically, this tells us something, that although we are focusing on a number of incidents all the time, in many cases, CFSP, if you simply look at the formal decisions, because this was limited to the formal decisions that have been taken by the Council, they're limited to a few issue areas only. That brings us to the suggestions that have been made by the Commission on the potential topics that could be used to implement QMV in CFSP. So if you go to the current Commission, von der Leyen Commission, in the State of the Union, human rights and sanctions were indeed mentioned. And those are indeed the areas that are very prominently present in CFSP. The former Juncker Commission also added civilian crisis management mission. I'm not sure, but we can discuss it, why that has dropped off the lists so suddenly. Because again, I would argue that if you want to have another candidate for QMV, then at least the civilian crisis management missions could still be included. Again, as I was saying, I'm talking about the formal decisions, because those are the ones that are following the decision-making procedure, end up at the Council. But we're not so much talking about the more informal ones. And that, of course, are the ones that Jan Wouters was referring to in the beginning. If declarations, for instance, are being blocked by certain member states. So there's not per se voting, I think, at stake in that sense. But again, member states are allowed and are willing, as we have seen, to block certain declarations also. Again, something for the discussion whether the distinctions should lie. To conclude, perhaps the final question is this one. Looking at what is sometimes called these days the normalization of CFSP, it has become a normal policy, much more than it was, let's say, 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, with the institutions being involved in a different way, with the External Action Service having this bridging role between institutions, with the court, not least, having a larger role, claiming a larger role on the basis of its general role in judicial protection on the basis of the treaties. So we've seen this normalization of CFSP, and should that be a moment, should that be a window perhaps even, to take another step and see which areas could actually be used for the application of QMV. Thank you very much. Jan, back to you, I think.
Thank you so much, Ramses, for this really, I think, again, very useful overview. I hope our participants are still fully with us. I still count 94 of them, so please stay with us, because we are now going to really enter the more interactive stage. We have seen a number of questions popping in. It's not easy to structure those questions. I'm going to try to do that by basically selecting a few questions, bring them together, and then return to the panel. And maybe while answering those questions, I would immediately say, if you as a panelist would like to comment upon what another panelist said, you should be absolutely free to do that. But let me identify 3 or 4 themes that have been popped up in the Q&A. First of all, I think the obvious question that has been raised by Julia Hunteman is, what would you consider to be areas in foreign policy that could be what we call the low-hanging fruit 4 cases of qualified majority vote. You have, of course, mentioned what President von der Leyen has argued. Ramses has added the civilian crisis management missions, but maybe you were thinking about some possible other cases. So what would be a good low-hanging fruit? A second question, and something very important, because we have heard this recently in Germany. Some of you may recall that the candidate of the Christian Democratic Party for the upcoming German federal elections, Mr. Armin Laschet, who besides is well known to some of us because he has been a very active member of the European Parliament before, but he has given a couple of speeches also about German foreign policy, and as part of those speeches, some ideas have again popped up with regard to majority voting in the European foreign policy, but also the Kern-Europa idea, the idea of a core of member states that could be a little bit the pioneers, the ones going forward more deeply. It's an idea that those of you who follow European integration have, of course, encountered long ago. I will refer back to the days even of the Maastricht Treaty, when we had Wolfgang Schäuble, for instance, already advocating the Kern-Europa idea. And there are many other forms of differentiated integration tools that I'm sure you would be familiar with. But the question is indeed, and the question comes from Alexei Jones, how does the QMV debate that we are having here relate to the discussion of a multi-speed Europe? Do you see something also in the ideas of a core group of member states in the area of common foreign and security policy? I come to a third set of questions, which is more the relationship with the other policies. And it has been mentioned, the community method policies. In other words, what after Lisbon we have become used to call the integrated policies, the other policies, in other words, everything, all the policies that are laid down under the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, everything except CFSP, because as you know, CFSP is special and it is the only policy area covered by the other treaty, the Treaty on European Union. But so the question has arisen here, when you are considering QMV, would it not be logical in a certain way to also think of some spillover effects from QMV used in the other more community method type of policies, which also show their own efficiency with regard to QMV? I immediately add the important caveat that Ambassador Vimont made, referring to the 2015 example of a QMV-based council decision on relocation that has actually not been properly implemented by all member states. But so this question of relationship with other policy fields of the EU is asked. Can there be a kind of somewhat natural, gradual spillover effect? Do we see this happening? Or do we rather see a strict, if you wish, silos of policy making, and that CFSP remains a very separate silo? And then last but not least, for this, let's say, restart of our discussions, a question coming from Anne Verhelst, who is a doctoral researcher at KU Leuven, and who is a real expert on NATO. And it maybe brings in a little bit of comparative perspective, looking at the practice of other international institutions. Anna focuses very much on NATO, and as you may know, NATO is really always doing decision-making by consensus. Consensus, which again is different from unanimity, but which may involve what we would call a de facto veto right of every member state. And the question is a little bit, let's say, Anna asks us, can we draw some lessons? Can we learn from the practice in NATO? But I would like to broaden it up a little bit by saying, can we learn something from certain decision-making processes in other international organizations? And you may choose which ones yourself. Voila, there we are again. I'm now going to ask the panel to pick up the conversation again. Ambassador Vimont, would you like to go first?
With Pleasure, Professor. I don't know if you want me to answer the four types of questions that have been put on the table, but maybe I will try as much as I can to just give you a sort of first attempt at answering these questions. On low-hanging fruits, I would be cautious about sanctions even if it's already there in the treaty, of course. But implementing a sanctions decision brings two different types of options, which both can be rather complicated for member states. Either you go for individual sanctions, and there my own experience shows that member states want to watch this very carefully. And this is surprisingly, by the way, and I think it was there in one of the questions put to you, which goes maybe against QMV, is that in the field of sanctions, member states have always managed to agree in spite of unanimity. And here again, on individual sanctions, I've seen a lot of hot exchanges, very difficult exchanges, because member states had strong feelings about individuals being put on the list. And at the end of the day, maybe it was the lowest common denominator that came out, but at least it came out and it showed that they were able to be united. And the same thing goes for economic sanctions, where also one could say that member states are very good to watch because, of course, there are national interests involved in those matters. So I would be somewhat cautious about the whole sanction issue as a low-hanging fruit. I would rather go for civilian operations and everything related to humanitarian assistance when we need to take formal decisions there, because this is one issue where you could find rather easily some sort of agreement among member states. The whole point about should we go for multi-speed Europe in the case of bringing more efficiency to decision-making process, to the decision-making process. Yes, and it's happening already, in fact, not only because of the provisions in the treaty that was mentioned a few minutes ago, about permanent structured cooperation or even enhanced cooperation in other fields, but simply because experience shows that this is what has been done. The whole point about the negotiation, the nuclear negotiation on the Iranian nuclear program was mostly dealt with 3 member states taking charge of the whole burden, with, and that's the most important point, with the support of the High Representative, which was part and in fact the chair of the group and even the chair of the international group of the EU 3+3 group. And that was, let's be honest, a very efficient option, a very efficient format that has been working very well in spite of all the difficulties. And could I mention, in spite of former President Trump's decision to withdraw from the GCPOA. At that time, one could have figured out that maybe we were going to see a strong split among EU member states. And that's the attempt by the EU3 to go ahead and to try to keep alive the nuclear deal went very well with the other member states. So this, for me, is a very good example of what I would call flexibility. More flexibility maybe should be brought into the whole CFSP process. One could imagine, and this is more or less what's happening at the moment with regard to some other crises, Venezuela, for instance, where some member states are leading and others are just watching and accepting and discussing it when necessary. But the core of the EEAS work and the CFSP process is mostly managed by a group of member states who feel more motivated than the others in dealing with this Latin American crisis. And one could imagine the same thing in Africa tomorrow, or maybe in Asia, who knows? But I think we should do more of this. And the way, for instance, the High Representative is giving a mandate to some foreign ministers to work on his behalf on Ethiopia, on Somalia, or other places in Africa, seems to me a very interesting way of moving forward. So yes, for more flexibility. Will there be spillover effects? I think that would require a very long discussion. But one point I would like to underline at this stage, because I don't want to monopolize the discussion, is as we go on, and as the treaty itself has been emphasizing time and again, we need to think as much in terms of external action as in terms of CFSP. In other words, today, foreign policy is as much about trade, competition, new tech, transport, etc., namely competences that belong to the EU Commission, and they are mostly led by the EU Commission, as much as what is being done in the more traditional, classical foreign policy field. And the simple fact that we need to bring these two parts of European policy together will naturally have some spillover at some stage, it seems to me, and we should go more for that. And that could be an interesting feature in the future of EU policy process as we go along. Can we use the NATO template? I'm not all that sure, because there we're moving into a military organization, which is for the time being quite different from the EU, not only because it's dealing entirely, nearly exclusively with military affairs, which is not the case of Europe, and because, of course, in NATO, there is something that we always need to keep in mind, which is the geopolitical dimension of it. It is that one country represents a primus inter pares, a military power that, of course, overlooks all the other ones. And you don't have exactly the same thing in Europe even. And I very much enjoy what Karolina said about the culture and the current frustration of the most small member states, because I personally think it's one of the major issues that CFSP has to deal with, and something where we need definitely to come with some more efficient answer that we have been able to do up to now. And which at the same time is the illustration of a reality, is that in terms of diplomatic network, of diplomatic expertise and experience, some member states are more equal than others, I would say, and that's a problem. I'll stop there. I've been too long.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. No, it's fascinating what you're saying. So thank you really for sharing those thoughts. Well, let's continue in the order of the speakers. Karolina?
Thank you. My answer partly overlaps with what Ambassador had just said. On the low-hanging fruits, I would say indeed what first comes to mind are human rights and sanctions. However, I would also advise to be cautious, especially with human rights. We have seen, for example, recently a lot of legal cases when human rights arguments were brought in environmental policies. This is just an example how human rights now kind of spill over to many other areas. So it could be that then we would start engaging in a lot of lengthy debates, whether a measure is about human rights or something else. And this is also what we don't want to have. So I'm not sure, I'm not convinced this is the right way to move forward. And about the sanctions, I am curious whether indeed it was always the case that the member states agreed on sanctions, or whether there were also some non-decisions. So I guess when we look at the decisions and what was the agenda, those were the points, the sanctions they agreed. But what about the instances where certain sanctions never made it to the agenda and no decision was made? I think also there was a case once of Cuba and Spain actually using its power, but this is something for longer discussion. On multi-speed Europe,
Karolina,
yeah.
can I maybe quickly add a little element to the question on QMV, low-hanging fruit? We had an additional question popping up just now, in which an anonymous participant, so it's important to highlight that, asks whether it would make sense also to think of QMV for positions that the EU would take in UN-related bodies. Think, for instance, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, where there have been quite a number of EU, say, draft initiatives, draft resolutions. Some of them have been kept up because one of our member states basically blocked it. I will not use the word veto anymore, but you will recall, for instance, a critical draft resolution regarding human rights in China. And then there was a member state who happens to have one of its ports being owned by China, who said it was not a proper way of, interacting with China. So, I mean, this happens from time to time. But would it make sense to also see it as a low-hanging fruit to have, at least for those external positions in, for instance, the UN, to use QMV? The lawyers can also, of course, give their views about the possibility of that, but I want to ask your political view. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I also would advise being cautious here, because of course those positions are taken on the basis and are linked to negotiations in the Council. So it's not like they are completely two different worlds. And I think, if I remember correctly, what happened, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the presidency was reading out the list of countries that supported the measure and simply omitted one of them. And that was yeah, maybe creative way to move around it, but not, again, very happily received, because that opens up to other situations when, you know, every member state can be in this position potentially. On the multi-speed Europe, I think this is an idea that is kind of potentially dangerous for South and for the East. And also it may produce backlash when it comes to public opinion and the support for the EU, which is quite high. Of course, understandably, if the member states from the core decide to move forward, they will do so. But I think this is quite a different situation from what we are talking about here, QMV, because I think with QMV, you also bind the countries that are in the minority, right? And when you actually have multi-speed Europe, or you have some idea of core, then you don't bind. The decisions are not binding for those countries. So this is maybe a lighter option. Nonetheless, I also think it can be dangerous. About the spillover, I think we've already seen it was a no-functionalist idea. The spillover did not happen automatically. This was one of the weaknesses of this theory. So if it doesn't, it might still obviously occur, but it hadn't. So the idea is, well, if it hadn't, does it make sense to force it? Right? I'm not sure about that. What we've seen from the same theory, that what did happen is the high-level socialization of elites and convergence when it comes to values and norms. So that is already, one could say, a big step forward. But what we see, if the elites and governments are being changed and the governments come with completely different ideas, then we also see limitations to those socialization processes, because they simply take people out and they come up with different set of rules. And for example, what is a weakness to other member states becomes an act of heroism in those countries and standing for your own sovereignty. And on NATO, I have the same opinion as Ambassador Vimont. And here is important to note that also, yeah, indeed, we have United States, so it's very difficult to compare.
Thank you very much. We turn now to the lawyers. Stefan in the first place.
Thank you, Jan. I'll also try to follow more or less the order of the questions that I've seen and that you already commented on, and concentrating perhaps on the more legal ones. But low-hanging fruit, I think what easily comes to mind is EU special representatives. I mean, there we've had qualified majorities since a long time, and but again, you know, it's I've never seen any decision by qualified majority being taken there. I remember one instance, I think, when I still was working in the council, where indeed I think the chair of the REDEX working party tried to put some pressure on some reluctant member states by, and I remember even as council legal service, indeed, I think I took the floor to remind the delegations that we were under qualified majority. And so there was this small instance where indeed the chair tried to put up a little bit of pressure, you know, is what I think, Karolina, you call the shadow of QMV. But yeah, EUSRs, I mean, I don't really see, you know, how appointing an EUSR should really be subject to unanimity. I mean, it is not legally, and why this should be an issue. After all, we're only talking about indeed a political figure that represents as an extended arm of the HR and fulfills a mandate adopted by the council. But yeah, so that would be, I think, one case of a low-hanging fruit in my view. There was one question I think you didn't allude to, Jan, from Sarah Poli, got a member state blocking sanctions after the Treaty of Lisbon. Well, I think as we discussed before, I mean, there's no voting on sanctions, even on implementing decisions where qualified majority would be possible. So again, I wouldn't say it's a matter of one member state blocking, but again, the chair of the relevant working party being the RELEX chair, then the RELEX party, and then subsequently, even at COREPER or council, the chair will seek consensus, even on one single listing. And the matter will not be put to a vote, and so there's no, again, I think that's linked a bit to the veto right. There's no, you know, open blockage, but you know, member states will make it known that indeed they're still not quite happy, and the list then will be adapted accordingly. There was one, I think, very good question on the recent case law of the Court of Justice. I think Ramses, you alluded to that too, in relation to the CSDP. Indeed, where the court is going down the road, and we are involved in a number of these cases as we speak. And indeed, where the court indeed interprets the exemption to its jurisdiction in Article 24 very narrowly, and indeed tries to indeed do its part as regards the normalization of the CFSP. However, the issue there is, and that's, I think, a fundamental one, any decision adopted by the council on and the parliament, for that matter, in the under the TFEU by qualified majority can be challenged by any member of the council and the member state having voted against before the Court of Justice, or by any member state. This is not possible under the CFSP. So if you imagine the council adopting by qualified majority a decision on, be it sanctions or a civilian operation or whatever, the member states cannot go to, the member states who feel outvoted cannot defend what their perceived rights, because the Court of Justice would have to declare itself incompetent if it's about indeed the validity of the decision of the council as such, and if it's not about the cases that, you know, about staff management in a civilian mission and things like that that the court has highlighted. So that is still, I think, an obstacle there. Then we would have to change the treaties and indeed expand the jurisdiction of the court, which would be quite generally to the CFSP, which might be logical, but of course raises a number of difficult questions. The multi-speed Europe, no, I think there, at least from a legal institution point of view, we are talking about two completely different things. QMV is a method of voting. It's about a council decision in the CFSP, and a council decision adopted by under the CFSP. Whatever the voting rule is a decision binding, an decision of the EU. We have they're now a bit hidden at the end of the TFEU. We have still. Let's not forget the provisions on enhanced cooperation that also cover the CFSP, and where the council by unanimous decision could allow indeed a group of member states to go forward, but that has not been used until now. QMV boosting coherence, well, yes and no. I don't quite see, QMV is just a decision-making process. It's a voting rule. It might speed up decision-making, but I mean, if it were to be applied, my view is indeed, I mean, the outcome is an EU policy decision or an EU decision, a council decision, etc. I think there, but that's linked perhaps to this this perception of the CFSP still having some intergovernmental aspects. That because in the discussions we're having also on EU unity, this comes up quite often on the part of member states that, or at least some of them, that suggest that, well, a decision by QMV, and that's maybe linked to the question of ownership, would not be then a true or proper EU decision. But I don't see that. I mean, of course it is. I mean, you know, no one would suggest under the TFU that a legislative act adopted by qualified majority is not an EU legislative act, just because some member states voted against. QMV at the UN, again, I think this is linked. I think, and Karolina made the point already. No, I mean, there cannot be any difference there. I mean, the policies are decided by the Council in Brussels, not in New York. Local coordination, even though in practice, of course, we have a lot of statements made on a daily basis by my colleagues in New York that are never hardly ever seen in Brussels, and that is okay because the member states in New York, I mean, also get the instructions from capital, so it's not as if they were bypassed. But in terms of formal decision-making process, you cannot distinguish between that takes place in Brussels. Whatever the statement is about, whether any statement is to be delivered at the UN or elsewhere. But again, there we have the difficulty anyway that political statements are not subject to voting in the first place. And then lastly, although perhaps what I could mention there, perhaps for further questions or discussions, is indeed, and that was a suggestion that I found quite interesting, that made, I think, in the context of discussions within the Political and Security Committee made by the Council Legal Service, who encouraged, in fact, the HR perhaps and the Council to use Article 29 of the TU also for statements. And indeed, if you look at Article 29, and these are the old common positions, indeed, positions of the EU. And I remember from my early days in the Council that that provision, or the predecessor of that provision, was used to actually define a policy. Those were not, they didn't look like legal acts. They set out a certain strategy of the EU vis-a-vis some African countries, for example, or on human rights, etc. However, in the form of a legal act, and this practice has basically been abandoned somehow, even before Lisbon. But that could be a way to, trigger potentially then implementing decisions on qualified majority. I mean, that's what we tried with the Human Rights Action Plan, but it miserably failed in front of Coreper, I think. So we are still not there yet, but still something worth exploring. And then lastly, there was one question, I think, on military operations. No, I think the treaty rules, they are quite clear. First of all, indeed, Article 31, 2, paragraph 4, it is, I think, clearly excludes indeed any QMV for military operations. And so that is not possible. And that is why also, just as a last point on that is why I have doubts from a legal point of view whether the passerelle clause could be used to introduce qualified majority for civilian missions, because then I don't think that's possible, because Article 42, paragraph 4 of the TU does not distinguish between civilian and military missions, and it just requires unanimity in the Council. So first of all, I'm not sure whether via the passerelle clause the European Council could actually modify that voting rule, because it's expressly provided for in 42.4, and it doesn't distinguish between civilian and military operations. And there also there's an interesting question, and I'd be interested what Ramses thinks of that, how that passerelle clause then relates to the simplified treaty revision procedure in 48, paragraph 7 in relation to the CFSP. That is, I think, a bit still quite unclear. Okay, that I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's nice to trigger a number of additional questions, so they end up on the desk of Ramses. Ramses?
Yes, and I will now answer all of them. No, it's very interesting that what Stefan brings up. I mean, I would probably agree with you that the passerelle clause cannot be used for anything in CSDP, because it so clearly rules out QMV. So it would be contra legem, perhaps, to do anything that is so clearly conflicting something that was deliberately put in there. So yes, you would need a treaty change, and then the question of obviously is which one? Can we do that in a simplified form or not? Let's think and write about that. I don't have the answer yet. On the low-hanging fruit, well, obviously they're not that low. Otherwise, they would have been picked over the past 20 years or so. So they're pretty high up still. But one thing that comes to mind, listening again to you, is something that was done in a way with the introduction of the new global human rights sanction regime that was established December last year, including a CFSP decision and a regulation in which the member states already agreed on a large number of starting points. Obviously, the decision and the regulation are not new legal bases that can suddenly be used for sanctions in case of serious human rights violations. Obviously not, because you cannot simply introduce something on the basis of secondary law that is not already in the treaty. But I think what was meant there is let's not have all the discussions all the time. So we have this nice framework now on the basis of which we can more easily take decisions, even, by the way, keeping in mind that all the listings still need a modification of the original CFSP decision every time. But I think the idea was to have less discussion on things that you can agree on. If we could come up with something like that, having a sort of framework for certain areas, for instance, sanctions, for instance, human rights or humanitarian action, for instance, perhaps at a certain moment about a certain operations, civilian missions, then it would perhaps more easy for the Council, once they have unanimously adopted that part, to agree on QMV for the sort of more implementing elements of those policy areas. And that's my final point, Jan, because I know you want to go back to the audience for questions, but on spillover, again, what comes to mind here is the clear link between CFSP and other external action or other external relations these days, right? Especially, of course, since Lisbon, but even before, it was very difficult to completely separate CFSP from the other external relations policy areas. So whatever goes on there has an impact on CFSP, and CFSP has an impact on those policy areas. The objectives, as we all know, are brought together in the treaty in one single provision these days. So if you want to talk about spillover, I think that the mutual influence can no longer be ignored. So completely separating CFSP with its special rules and procedures is a bit outdated.
Thank you so much. We still have like 19 minutes, and I would like to make good news. We will stop punctually at 2 p.m. But let's still maybe capture some questions, but also develop a couple of things a little bit further. First of all, the wider Lisbon Treaty context. And as you all know, the Lisbon Treaty was very, very important for changing, I would say rather fundamentally, the external representation system of the European Union, the creation of the post of High Representative / Vice President, and so on. We could, of course, have a lot of discussions about the function and the multiple hats of the High Rep, but that's for a future seminar. I would like to ask you, however, relating to decision-making processes, you will recall that during the old Convention on the Future of Europe, that during that convention, there was the idea, let us try to replicate a little bit the community way of decision-making by making the High Representative, when she or he takes an initiative under CFSP, a kind of trusted broker, the honest broker, eerlijke makelaar idea, that the Commission is trusted when it makes a proposal under the other policies, and therefore the Council can adopt it with QMV. There was thinking in the Convention on the Future of Europe, let's try to do that and make the High Rep this kind of honest broker in CFSP. It hasn't really happened, as you all know, and there is a very minor exception in the treaties where you could read it into, but it's a very, very limited one. The question I want to ask to you, after nearly 12 years of practice, do you think that the High Rep, or if you wish by extension, the EEAS, could still incrementally grow into that role of trusted broker? Second point, very obvious, so you can immediately say yes or no, the role of the Commission in CFSP. Under the Lisbon Treaty, even more than under the previous treaties, the Commission has nearly vanished under CFSP, no specific individual initiative role anymore. But then we saw suddenly the Commission coming up with a communication suggesting more cases of majority-based decision-making under CFSP. What was your reaction to that? Did you appreciate that, or did you think the Commission should have shut up in this particular field? Then Brexit. Yes, I'm sorry, Brexit always pops up, but the obvious question coming from Gustavo Müller is, yeah, do you see any effects upon decision-making dynamics in CFSP from the Brexit case, positive or negative effects? And then, yes, we still had in the chat box a number of people, I would not call them diehards, maybe I'm just a diehard myself, but they are still advocating the QMV. And they basically ask the panel two things. First of all, there is still the question, yes, can you not look at the other areas of QMV in external relations, trade, environment, where the EU is perceived as a strong global power? And don't you think that this could be an example for the CFSP, at least in terms of speed, that decision-making would be enhanced? It's a question you have already discussed, the non-existence of spillover, but still there may be a kind of influence going from that practice. And secondly, that's a very nice question from Julia. It's a question, how would you structure an argument to convince an anti-federalist skeptical person that there are benefits to QMV? I love that question. That would be a nice exam question, Ramses, if ever you are looking for inspiration in that respect. A very, very last point, but then I quickly return to you for your quick feedback. And you could have probably expected the question, is there anything of what we are discussing today that could be usefully brought to the new conference on the future of Europe? I would like to go back now to the panel. Ambassador Vimont, could you take the floor? Thank you.
With pleasure, Professor, with pleasure. Starting with quickly with your first question about could the High Representative be an honest broker? Yes, of course, but here again, coming back to what I was saying earlier, this can only be a gradual approach. And it seems to me that more than anything else, starting with the new Lisbon Treaty architecture with regard to institutional architecture, with regard to CFSP, I would go once again upstream with regard to decision-making process. We tend too often to go right down to the bottom at the time of decision, when decision has to be taken. But this is a very long process that starts with propositions, with communication for new strategies, etc. And this is where I think there is a need for an added value and a more ambitious input from the High Representative and the External Action Service. It's easy for me to say so, having been there and knowing how difficult it is. But I think one of the real difficulty, and that relates again back to what Karolina was saying about the sort of consensual culture, is that we know the EEAS officials, the High Representative know that if they come with a contentious paper, this will bring immediately divisions among member states, and therefore better to avoid that, and therefore better go for a sort of low profile discussion that will lack any sort of innovation or new ideas. And I personally think that's the real issue at the moment for the whole CFSP. is how to rekindle some kind of lively discussion, lively debate when we disagree on human rights with China, for instance, for all the reasons you mentioned and reminded us about. Let's have a clear discussion about this and try to see with new ideas how to overlook these difficulties and go forward. Because if you don't, the problem will come back again. It will strike back with a revenge, and you have to be aware of that. Straight answer about the Commission proposition, either by Jean-Claude Juncker or by Mrs. von der Leyen. No, I think they were in their role. It's the role of the Commission also to look as a sort of guardian of the treaty and of the integrity of the European process to come up with ideas if they want to. And once again, as I was saying earlier, the more we are able to articulate in a more efficient way elements of the external actions that are managed by the Commission and those that are managed by the High Representative, that's for the better. Now, I guess one point also is for the High Representative to improve also its working relations with the Commission, also with the European Council President. I've always been struck by how silent the Lisbon Treaty is on the relationship between these two big figures, and how maybe there's room there for improvement. Brexit, a very clear effect of Brexit seems to me very much related to the progress we have seen since 2016 on CSDP, on security and defense. PESCO would not have been launched if the UK was still there. It was obvious for all to see, and I think even my British friends would admit that. Now, from a global geopolitical vision, I think we still have not really understood and comprehended all the implication of Britain's departure from the EU and the sort of imbalance it has created in CFSP among member states. And this is something we will have to deal with as we go along. I could give many examples of this, but it would take too long. QMV, and coming back to the spillover of QMV in community matters, let's be careful. And coming back to a point that was made earlier on about the political dimension that we should always look at and what's happening in domestic politics with some of those populist or nationalist movements. Look at trade at the moment and how difficult it is becoming to get member states' endorsement of the outcome of the Commission's negotiations on trade, Mercosur, China, and you can go on and on. Qualified majority stops when suddenly you face real domestic political problems, and trade is definitely becoming a major issue now. So I think we need to look at all this with a global political vision of really what's going on in each and every one of the member states.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Many, many wise words, and we would love to, in a way, deepen some of these things at future events, including the very interesting point you made with regard to the not yet fully understood implications of the UK's departure for our own kind of internal relations between member states. Extremely interesting. Now, let's turn to Karolina.
Thank you. Since we are short of time, let me just pick some of the questions. The first one about the EEAS as an honest broker. I think, of course, it can become honest broker theoretically in the future. However, and here we always differ with my friends from legal side, for political scientists, we consider EEAS as an institution on its own. No legal institution, but for us, it's an institution with its own agenda, and its own political power, its political role in the system. So of course, what we do, we study that agenda and how it plays, for example, in the council. So it is difficult in a sense to have this role of an honest broker, especially what I heard, especially in the beginnings of the EEAS, not immediately, but some years later, is that there was a push for certain policies. The chairs were saying very clearly, I am asked by my management to push certain items, and some of them were happy, some of them were not happy. So it's also about the vision about what the EEAS should be. Should it really be a leader and take the leadership, which is partly what the member states, some member states asked, take initiative and be more active, but other member states are saying, well, we just want you for support, we want you to be an honest broker. So it's I think it's a clash of these roles, and we need to see how it will work out and what will be the position also of the highest levels in the EEAS. Of course, this is one of the options, not an easy one, and I think also maybe not an easy one to choose for the EEAS itself. And I cannot help but think of the approach of Javier Solana, and he was quite smart, I think, in kind of choosing the areas for his increased activity and role, which were not that much on the radar of member states. So he kind of wisely navigated and chose some areas that were not so disputed, and there he played a higher role, maybe, whereas elsewhere it was more low-key, more mediating, and more modest. About Brexit, I agree completely the progress on PESCO and CSDP. And it's interesting, again, it links to what I said before about socialization and social pressures, because obviously there were some countries that were really not happy about PESCO, but once UK was gone, even those countries joined because it is better to be in than out. So that was an interesting kind of side effect of Brexit. Then in the decision-making by itself, it's a bit difficult to say, because now we have other countries that sometimes when you interview diplomats, well, we have clearly other countries that kind of took a role of the UK, or even, yeah, they're playing even more difficult role. So it's difficult to compare because we are not exactly in the same situation as before. So that's why it's difficult here to isolate the Brexit effect directly on decision-making. And maybe for the future of Europe, for the new convention, I would say maybe to take into account the real politics and how the politics plays out, because it's going to be extremely important in how things play out. And this is what we've seen with EEAS, and also I would say take the warnings and advice of current practitioners seriously. And I remember the External Relations Commissioner and Javier Solana warning the convention not to double head the position, because they said they are distinct and it's just too much work. And that was not, that didn't come true, so to say. So maybe to give a bit more thought to that. But it's politics at the end of the day, and it will be political game at the convention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now Ramses, please, Ramses.
Thank you, Jan. A lot has been said. Let me just pick up two things. One effect of Brexit could very well be that we start thinking about the involvement of third countries in CFSP and CSDP a bit better. Of course, there's options, all kinds of options for them to align to CFSP positions. It's even possible for them to join CSDP missions, things like that. But it's not possible to be part of the actual decision-making. If you look at the rules of procedure of both the Council and the European Council, they're quite strict actually on allowing third states. Yet the question obviously came up during Brexit. And I think it's also in the interest of some of the member states to somehow involve certain third countries. And if I say the UK, then probably Norway will raise a finger, as well as perhaps even Turkey, to involve them somehow more closely into the decision-making process. The second point I want to make, and that's my final point, and that was also a point that was made by Alexandru Ursu, who is at the University of Groningen, so that's also another reason to mention his question, is perhaps related to the elephant in the room. So when we decide on QMV in CFSP, will that not somehow affect perhaps both the legitimacy of the decisions and the effectiveness of the decisions. I mean, I fully agree with Stefan that even if decisions are taken by QMV, they remain union decisions, obviously. But in CFSP, there's still something different. You need to have the full backup of the 27. If one of them goes their own way and there's no possibilities for enforcing them to align themselves with the positions or the actions, then we may have another problem. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. We now have to come to an end of this webinar. As you will see, we have raised many, many issues. We have partially answered quite a number of them, but of course, I hope you will share my feeling that this smacks for more, and we are only at the beginning of a deeper reflection. So in a certain way, I think our webinar today was a kind of amuse-gueule, as our French friends say, an amuse-gueule for the ENGAGE project that is now just kicking off. And again, I would like to invite you all very, very warmly to join us next week, Wednesday, the 16th of June, for the Kickoff Conference of the ENGAGE project. You have the link in the chat box. And as you know, there will be keynotes by the mentioned Dr. Javier Solana, by Josep Borrell, by Rosa Balfour, and others. I'm really very grateful to our distinguished panelists. I hope you will agree with me, they were a stellar cast. But I'm also very grateful to you as an audience for being so actively involved and raising so many interesting questions. Thank you so much. We really look forward to continuing our conversations. If ever you have suggestions for topics for future events, we always hope that we can receive such feedback from you, and we definitely hope to see you back at our future events. Again, thank you all so much. Have a great day, and looking forward to see each other back very soon. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.